All right, gang. So tonight we're going to start a short 4-day unit on independence movements in the second half of the 20th century. Today we've already talked about this portion. What happened after World War II and the international creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we talked about that today in class, or should have. And then the next thing we're going to talk about, so in this kind of 3-day unit, 4-day unit, we're going to look at the political, economic, social, and cultural aspects of all the independence movements that took place around the world after World War II. And here's how we're going to do that. We're going to describe struggles for self-rule in India. That's what we're going to do tonight with Gandhi and the development of democracy in India. We're going to look at Africa, including a guy named Jomo Kenyatta and Nelson Mandela. And then lastly, we're going to look at what happens in the Middle East and kind of the result of all the problems in the Middle East and the cause of all the problems in the Middle East by looking at two people, one Golda Meir and a gentleman named Gamal Abdul Nasser. All right, so let's first begin with India. Well, if you guys will remember, Britain ruled India for a long, long time. And the reason they did this was so that they could really tightly control the economy. The industry produced in India was mostly handicrafts, not the machines that Britain had. And in fact, Britain would not let India develop their economy and develop their industry and create factories. And so industry or handicrafts made up about 10 to 15% of their economy. Well, what Britain really wanted out of India was cotton, and this is their main form of agriculture. Their main industrial or agricultural output was cotton. But you can't eat cotton. And this made up about 75% of their industry. And so they produced a lot of things with this. Well, the British also had to have people rule for them. And so the third economic sector, so we've got primary economic sector, secondary economic sector, and social services made up most of the third economic sector, third tertiary sector. And that made up about 10 to 15% of the total economy. Now, one thing that they did was that the British also built railroads in India. And that's really good because it really highly improves the infrastructure of India. But those railroads were predominantly used to get the raw materials out of India and move them to ports. And that's what the British really wanted. And the native Indians really resented this against the British, and as you guys will remember. Okay, well, they were considered the crown jewel in the British Empire. The reason was because they had a lot of wealth. They produced a lot of wealth for them, and they were relatively stable and didn't revolt a whole lot. A lot were not happy with it, but they did not try to overthrow the government. Well, that comes later. But one thing that Britain did do to benefit India was to improve their infrastructure. So let's talk about the Indian nationalist movement and their begin to push for independence. Well, at its beginnings, if you remember, the Indians gained in English education, and many of the upper level or those that worked in the service sector for the British Empire were Indians. If you remember, the British used indirect rule, which means basically they allowed the natives to work, or Indians to work, but they educated them just as they would be in England. And this instilled a sense of nationalism and a sense of democracy, that they should have a say in their government and that they should be proud of their nation. Well, the beginnings of this comes with the formation of the Indian National Congress in 1885. The Indian National Congress is a Hindu political party that pushes for Indian independence. And they were the first political party based around the idea of one religion and two independence from the British government. In response to this, and kind of much later, obviously, is the formation of the Muslim League. The Muslim League was formed in 1906. The Muslim League was a group of, think about it, Muslims for independence. And so it is with this push that now, rolling into World War I, as nationalist movements and anti-imperial movements begin to emerge around the world, Indians begin to push and really ask for their own independence. Well, Indian independence is really advocated by a gentleman named Mohandas Gandhi. Mohandas Gandhi was born in 1869, and he died in 1948. He was assassinated, actually. Well, Mohandas Gandhi initially worked as a social worker and a lawyer, and he was educated in England and worked in South Africa, and he saw the South African independence movement. And he saw South Africans gain self-rule, and he said, I want to take that home to my country. He saw the idea of self-rule, the South Africans being to govern themselves following their Boer Wars. And he said, Indians should be allowed to do the same thing. We are no different than South Africans, and so we should be able to have that. And the method that Mohandas K. Gandhi used, was called civil disobedience. Essentially, civil disobedience is the idea that when you find a law unjust, you don't violently revolt against it. You raise awareness of it, and you protest that rule, that law, through peaceful protest. Hunger strikes are a very common method. Marches are a very common method that Gandhi used in protesting British rule, which he felt was unjust, and the idea that they did not have self-rule. He used civil disobedience for several reasons. One, there was no chance of violent revolt. He knew the Indians would be squashed. Britain, if you'll remember, was the largest, strongest government going into World War II, and he said, there's no way. He said, and they did this through boycotts. They refused to buy British products. You'll see here a weaving wheel, and the weaving wheel, or spindle rather, was used as a symbol of Indian nationalism because he thought that everyone should have that in the home in order to become self-sufficient, so that they could weave their own fabric, make their own thread, and then make their own clothes. And that's a really important note because they did not want to buy British products. Other nonviolent actions, protests, marches to the sea. There was something called the Salt March, in which they marched to the sea, and they were met violently with these revolts. And so when someone is not responding violently to actions, it makes the government look really bad, or the people look really bad when you've got peaceful protesters who are being attacked violently by British. Well, following World War II, tensions increased, or as tensions increased in the 1920s and 1930s, Britain realized that their hands were full. And what we also notice is that there's an increase in Muslim and Hindu tensions in India. India, if you guys will remember, and I want you to make note of this, India at the time included all of this area. So all of that area was under British control. The Hindu wanted control of it. Well, at the same time, the Muslims wanted control of northwest India, and that's because that's where most Muslims lived in India. Now, there were Muslims throughout India, but they were predominantly centered in northwest India. I mean, you can think back historically to the Mughals, and that's where the Mughals came from, and so that's why they wanted to control that area. Well, there were actually riots in 1924 over this, and they were put down eventually, but Gandhi kept pushing for peaceful resistance and kept pushing for Indian self-rule. Well, in 1947, following World War II, there was massive amounts of independence movements, as we've talked about. And finally, the United Nations was given control of India by the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom said, we don't want any control. The English people had lost interest in governing their colonies after World War II, and those colonies were pushing for their independence. So it's not like the English just said, oh, no, we don't want it. The English said, we can't afford to put them down. And so what they wanted to focus on was rebuilding their country following World War II, and they just couldn't afford to manage their colonies as well. So in 1947, under UN control, India and Pakistan are recognized as two separate countries. Now, a close friend of Gandhi's is appointed prime minister, and a close friend, his name is Jawaharlal Nehru. So Nehru is elected prime minister of this new India. It is very important to note that India is partitioned or divided up into Pakistan, Muslim country, and East Pakistan, which is right here, which today is Bangladesh. Okay? And these other areas have their own self-rule. But India right here is governed by Jawaharlal Nehru. Things you need to know. There's struggle for democracy. There's still violence amongst Muslims and Hindus. And two, he was a close friend of Gandhi. Know those things about Nehru. Well, in 1948, Gandhi is assassinated by a Hindu who doesn't believe that Hindus should cooperate with Muslims. Gandhi was very cooperative. Gandhi believed that Hindus and Muslims should cooperate together. Well, in 1971, Pakistan splits. East Pakistan splits to form its own country of Bangladesh. Well, coming shortly after that, and around the same time, a woman named Indira Gandhi is elected Prime Minister of India. Now, I mentioned in an earlier video that some countries, during the Cold War, Some countries take a third way, a way of non-alignment. Well, non-alignment was Nehru's plan. Well, when Indira Gandhi becomes Prime Minister of India, she says, no, I want to change this idea, and I want to develop a slightly closer relationship to the USSR. And so she develops a close diplomatic relationship with the USSR, partially because she knows that they are closer geographically, and she doesn't want them to invade, but also because she believes it is the best way to economic success for her country. And one of the things that she does as Prime Minister, she helps develop a nuclear program. The reason this nuclear program is important is because Pakistan also eventually develops its own nuclear program. The reason they both feel that they need a nuclear program is because they are fighting over Kashmir, which we talked about extensively in my geography classes. Kashmir is this area of northern India and northern Pakistan that tried to become independent. Then India wanted it, then Pakistan wanted it, and it's all very important. And China wants even a part of it, and it's all very important because it controls the headwaters of the Indus River, which flow right through Pakistan. So those are some of the tensions and the issues revolving around the partition of India and Indian independence. Remember, India struggled for democracy that was led, or independence. Indian democracy and independence was led by Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi used nonviolent, peaceful protest. A close friend of his, Jawaharlal Nehru, took control as prime minister, and as prime minister, he tries to democratize India. He develops their industry. I forgot to mention that. He really rapidly develops their industry along the U.S. model. Even though he tries to choose non-alignment, he tries capitalism based on what the U.S. does. But after Gandhi is assassinated several years later, Indira Gandhi is elected, not kin to the other Gandhi, is elected prime minister. And she says, no, we're going to differ and we're going to go closer to the USSR and we're going to develop a nuclear weapon program to protect against Pakistan and Muslim invasion of India over the conflict of Kashmir. Have a great day. Bye.